Wells Lewis and his family moved into a Summit Avenue home in October 1917. He was 3 months old. His mother was a native New Yorker named Grace. Until marriage, she supported her family as an assistant editor at a turn-of-the-century Vogue magazine. His father was a native Minnesotan named Sinclair. Graduating from Yale, Sinclair had moved to New York City and built a reputation writing short stories for prominent magazines. Wells and his parents were moving to Minnesota so that Sinclair could begin work on a serious novel. It was to be about his experiences growing up in rural Sauk Center. The name of the book was Main Street. Wells Lewis spent his first years in St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Mankato. All the while, Sinclair gathered information and inspiration for his novel. Main Street was published in 1920. A seismic and controversial book, it became the bestseller of the year and eventually sold over 2 million copies. It later won for Sinclair Lewis the Nobel Prize for Literature, the first time a Nobel had gone to an American author. Overnight, Sinclair Lewis became an international celebrity. Wells Lewis was born into a roving family that never lived in one place for too long. Sinclair insisted on changing surroundings often, or else he would feel his inspiration for writing beginning to slacken, and then he would fall into a restless melancholy. As a rule, the family subletted furnished houses rather than furnishing their own, and they never stayed longer than the span of a lease. Wells's father was a blunt, aggressive man who was single-minded in his desire for fame. The preservation of his creative impulses was the chief goal of the entire family. Sinclair's relationship with Grace was based on her talent as a sounding board for his story ideas. He did not particularly enjoy the presence of his son. When Sinclair was busy writing, Wells was kept far away so that the noise of his play did not cause distraction. Wells Lewis grew up an only and a lonely child. His life was nannies and maids and glimpses of the prominent people who skirted in and out of the house on business with his father. But he was, by all accounts, an extremely well-behaved child. The son of a globe-trotting novelist, he did not go to school. Private tutors were paid in every city where the Lewises signed a lease. He inherited his father's imagination. His childhood drawings depict the sights, the epiphanies, and the deep feelings of a privileged boy who was nonetheless confused, alone, and alien in every place his family stopped. He was, his mother lamented, a hotel child. Wells was kept sheltered from his parents' crumbling marriage, undercut by Sinclair's infidelities in the wake of his success. At 6 years old, he was enrolled in the first of many European boarding schools. He was younger than the average student, but he quickly caught on and impressed his classmates. Life in Europe forever imprinted itself on Wells. Like Sinclair, who stayed in town long enough to snap up new inspiration for his novels, Wells diligently snatched up his own pieces from his many homes. By the time he was in his teens, he spoke multiple languages, German and Italian passably, French fluently. He had made a reputation among his schoolmates as being an outspoken boy who would argue any point to exhaustion. He insistently pressed one school acquaintance to write play after play for the school theater, and was rewarded with each play's most bizarre roles. Succumbing further to his success, Sinclair began to drink heavily. Grace, disillusioned with their rootless life, never sure when she would see her husband next, was fed up. In 1924, Wells's parents separated and eventually divorced. Wells continued with his education, which his father continued to fund. His mother married a wealthy man, and with them, Wells continued to travel the world. Wells enrolled in Harvard in 1935. He had grown into a tall, handsome young man. He could be serious and intense, but he had a capacity for lightness and charm that his father never learned. He loved music, books, and politics. At school, he majored in history. In his senior year, he published his first novel. They Still Say No. It was a story about college students of his generation, confused by the new sexual awakening brought on by the Roaring Twenties. A Depression-era novel, it spoke to the differences between the excesses of the generation in the 20s and Wells's generation, which had to deal with the fallout of that lifestyle. Wells insisted on getting no help on the book from his father. Sinclair thought up only the book's title while advising Wells to pick a different publisher than his own. Reviews of the book were positive, though some critics were hesitant about Wells's gifts, curious how much assistance Sinclair had provided. It was common consensus that the book had much more promise than the early magazine fiction of his father. In 1939, Wells graduated from Harvard magna cum laude. He seemed to have limitless potential. But Wells opted to join the Army as a private, a full year before the U.S. entrance into the war. A Harvard graduate with a publishing history and a well-connected father, he was poised to make his own great achievements in the world. And yet, he chose to enlist. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, Wells was sent to combat in northern Africa with the 443rd Artillery Corps of the 36th Infantry Division. High scores on exams brought Wells to the attention of his superiors, and he earned promotion to first lieutenant. He became an instructor to his fellow recruits in a number of different courses. When he entered combat, he told his parents that he had a safe job at headquarters to save them from worry, but his job was on the front lines with the field artillery. He saw wearying combat in North Africa and the Italian campaign. During one battle under heavy shelling, Wells put his life at risk to help unload a burning ammunition truck. For this courageous act, he was awarded the Silver Star. When the Allies began the D-Day invasion, Wells was on a ship bound for the French shores. Once in France, his division came under the command of Minneapolis native Major General John Dahlquist. Wells applied for and became the general's personal aide, and he quickly proved his worth. Sent by Dahlquist on a secret mission in which he encountered a group of French irregulars, Wells's fluent French allowed him to lead both French and American soldiers in a coordinated attack on a key village. In the battle, Wells managed to capture 5 German soldiers, armed only with his pistol. For this feat, he earned the Bronze Star. By mid-1944, with victory imminent, Wells began to consider where a man of his abilities could best serve in a post-war environment. In a letter dated July 10, 1944, Wells wrote to his mother, "I have been shelled, bombed, and shot at more times than I like to remember, and stood up under it pretty well. I feel that I could be doing a much more valuable job elsewhere. There are not so many who could contribute actively to the betterment of Franco-American relations." He saw for himself a job as a liaison for the U.S. military in France. The hotel child could finally put his education and European years to use for his own country. But on October 29, 1944, all that Wells was thinking about was the 1st Battalion of the 141st Infantry Regiment, which had been cut off and surrounded by German forces south of Paris. Wells drove General Dahlquist in a jeep from position to position as he orchestrated a rescue. During one stop, as the general plotted, a German sniper fired on them. Wells was hit. In Dahlquist's own account, Wells fell into his arms, killed instantly by the bullet. In an instant, the fate of this bright young man had come to pass, and the war had claimed a dear casualty. The death of Wells Lewis was the loss of a great talent, but it was far from a meaningless random event. Even as he was laid to rest in the French soil, this young man who could never call a patch of earth home was an American soldier, one of the greatest generation, who sacrificed his promise and his privilege in the spirit of public service that defined this moment in his nation's history. His war experience would have colored the rest of his career had he survived to continue it. And yet, as with so many other young men of his generation, his legacy would have to remain what he died for.